Alright, draft science video was going to get onto the subject of forces in the disciplined logical way, but instead I'm going to do this stupid pyrrho response video. Just because there's just so many lies in it, and it's just, you know, you have to defend yourself against liars, and that's, it's just one of the liabilities of life on this planet, is the liars can say disgusting things, and they can get away with it, and so I mean, just for the record, I'm just going to I mean, look, in the video I pointed out, he sits there and misparaphrased me constantly, keeps saying I'm claiming something I'm not claiming. So now he's saying I have in some way rejected Galileo by not accepting that Galileo believed that there was no such thing as absolute velocity. And I don't think there's any evidence that at all. I've never seen the quote of Galileo making any such speculations. He was just making the observation that perceptually we can't tell the difference. When you're moving, and you have velocity, not acceleration, that you can't tell you're moving. Nothing gives it away. And so therefore, if you're watching somebody else, you're going to see them relative to your movement. So if you're already moving towards them and you see them coming towards you, you're going to end up adding both of those velocities in what you see. That's all. He's just talking about what we see, not what is, what we see. And he says that somehow I'm rejecting that.
Like this. We wouldn't know that, it occurred to me, right? Because, it's probably better for you guys this way. So time's going along, and our thoughts are forming, chemistry's happening, neurons are firing. Oh, and then time starts to go backward. Well, that wheel now is going backwards.
Right, so he's saying time can go backwards. He thinks that you can count these pieces of distance and the movement of force in different frames in different ways. You not only can go forward, but you can go somehow backward. And I'd argue there's absolutely no evidence of that, and that all movement is related to this thing called speed of force. So the speed of light is what we've connected it to, and we found a certain certainty that a certain amount of distance in open space will be covered by a force in a certain amount of time. That's it. That's all that's really been established, and that's the constant from which you can make comparisons. So if you could put a light clock, something that just measures, a photon goes 1 meter and then bounces back again, and that's your consistent measurement of time. His argument is that I can take that clock somewhere and it won't measure. It will measure a relative time. I can accelerate the clock, and the clock will somehow still function exactly the same. And my argument is kind of simple in this respect. That if you're moving forward, obviously the emitter and the reflector, okay, so this is your emitter and your receiver. And this distance is not going to stay the same if this experiment is moving. The experiment is moving. When the light leaves, the mirror is going to move towards it. So there's going to be a change in the perceived speed when you add the two speeds up. Okay, you're not going to have the speed of light anymore. You're going to have the speed of light plus the movement of the reflector towards the light. And that's going to be the practical speed, the actual effect speed, in the sense that you're not going to move the required 1 meter. Now you're going to move a lot less than a meter when you hit the mirror. So the argument's that simple. The light hasn't broken. What's broken is the experiment is broken, because the reflector's moving. And I'm arguing that velocity does the same thing to the guts of matter. It's moving the mirrors. It's moving the reflectors. All of the relationships of the material bodies inside of you are being altered when you have velocity. And the simple explanation for that is that your matter exists in 3 dimensions, and forces like magnetism and gravity and light These are all forces. The things that move the speed of light are force. And the elements of force, whatever you want to think of them as, waves or quanta, it doesn't, are whatever, balloons, arrows, fish, it doesn't matter. The elements of the force are the thing that arrives. And the elements travel in straight lines. That's established by Maxwell and by all the other guys who did all those experiments with electricity, And so yeah, light behaves the same way. It moves in straight lines until it hits something, until it interacts with something. It moves in a straight line. Now, his argument is because something's moving, that somehow there's a warp in the space, and now things can bend. Light can go around the corner because it falls into something, or it it goes into some stretch zone where somehow the rules change. And I'm just simply arguing there's no evidence of a rule change. The effect is just this simple. You're changing the experiment. The light never changes. The experiment changes. The hardware the light's interacting with changes. Alright, so yeah, the simple argument is that this is a photon. It's just a thing moving in a straight line. Matter adds these other two dimensions. This is what matter has. Okay, so matter has stuff not moving just in one direction, the speed of light. Matter has stuff in it moving in a lot of directions at the speed of light. And all of those directions have to be moved in the direction of your velocity. And it is the movement of those things through the capture of force that creates your velocity, the frame. And it's completely inside of you. So when you're moving, there's no change outside of you. There's only change inside of you. You change. Space doesn't change. Time doesn't change. Your matter changes. That's the simple argument. And it doesn't extend one tiny millimeter beyond you. Okay, the thing moving. The stuff moving the speed of light. The three-dimensional stuff moving the speed of light is the only thing being affected. And that's what I mean by a broken clock, in the sense that you're not working the same. The mirrors are moving. They have to be moved. Alright, and so obviously when you start accelerating matter, what you're necessitating is that you're creating more arrow going this way. Now, you can do that by capturing force between. So if there's two electrons and there's an amount of force between them, alright, the magnetic forces that are repelling them, you can add more force in between the electrons. And that's certainly a way of conveying this extra velocity, this extra amount of stuff going in the direction you're going to end up moving. You're changing the collective balance. So if you have a balance of equal amounts going in one direction, and then you add extra going in one direction in the form of force between your material bits, then obviously this will move at a speed. Now, this is going to be much slower than the speed of light, because matter's got a lot of other elements that have to be pushed. Each one of them has to go. And they don't go on their own. The elements don't have momentum, except in the direction they're traveling. So the quanta only can go the direction they're going. They can never carry momentum. So unlike the baseball analogy, if I'm on a train and I throw a baseball off the train horizontally, perpendicular to my movement, at somebody on the ground, let's say, stationary, obviously I can't just throw it normally, like what I'm seeing. If I throw it as I see it, the baseball will miss him entirely, because the baseball is going to keep going the direction I'm moving. So it's going to go, let's say, 60 miles an hour this way, and it might go 70 or 80 miles an hour the way I'm throwing it. And the combination is going to be this thing over here. The baseball is going to end up way forward of where I intended, or where I threw it, because the baseball is going to keep my momentum. A beam of light won't do that. So if I'm in a spaceship moving and I shoot a beam of light perpendicular to my movement, it's not going to move forward with me. It's not going to keep going. It's going to go exactly where I shot it. Nowhere else. And where I shot it, if you're the camera and you're attached to me, you're going to move too. You're going to move out of the way of the light. The light's not going to be able to get to you before you disappeared. You left the scene. And that's the truth. So obviously a light clock won't work in velocity. And that was one of the points I was making. Alright. So what else do I want to say? So anyway, yeah, so I think that a real understanding is just to understand this dimensionality argument. The elemental particles are these quanta moving the speed of light. They only exist in one dimension, the dimension they're moving in. That's the only dimension they have mass in. I think it's just fundamentally important to understand that. Anything else, okay, like electrons might be two-dimensional, they might be three, but I think they're only two because they can't maintain any kind of velocity. You can accelerate them, you can push them, but they'll not maintain where you threw them. You always have to throw them with a bunch of force continuing to push them. You have to push them with force or they'll stop moving. And the same with protons. So the elemental bits don't do this maintain your inertia thing. It's only the complex structure of a material atom that can do it. And it does it, okay, by essentially rolling on the space. By the proton and the electron rotating their positions to each other. And the only way they can do that is they have to migrate force. They have to take force that came in and somehow keep reapplying it. They have to keep it, they have to cycle it through them. And they probably do that. This, you know, I don't know in this video if I need to explain. But they probably do that by a disproportion of the bits. So there's, say if there was more electrons, then that means the force has to go through and push the electrons forward. And that would take a lot longer than if there was only two on the other side going back. Then the force can go back really quick. And that would sort of be the change. But it's all this, back to this square box thing. That when force goes into an electron, it can come out completely perpendicularly. So you can put force in this side and it'll come out completely perpendicularly. And that's the power of electrons. And so obviously they can trap force. And that's a very interesting feature of the function of matter. The individual electrons aren't really doing the moving. The force is doing the moving. But the electrons are channeling the force to make that possible. Alright. I don't want to get into this too deep. I mean, I don't want to get into the material changes because that's not the substance of this argument. The substance of this argument is there's no hard evidence of any kind of bent time dimension. There's only hard evidence of a correlation between giving matter velocity and it changing in terms of its function. And that would be my argument is that's because it has a whole bunch more force moving inside of it. That's why it's moving. It got force pushed into it. And as Newton would say, it's going to keep moving until another force acts on it. Takes the force away or applies the force in the opposite direction to negate the force.
The electrical impulses, electrical impulses that were going forward, they're now unrolling. They're going backwards. The memories that we're forming through our chemical processes in the brain, whatever they are, they're going backwards, right? Time going backwards just means that all the physics that we have goes backward.
All right, I'm just saying I don't see any evidence of anything ever going backwards, as he says. So he can say it, but I don't think there's any evidence of it.
The way the math works out, it's actually fine with physics that time might go backward.
Right, so whatever. So they have math for a false circumstance that has no relation to any real circumstance. Great. And that's more evidence of why they're right, is because they have math that details Bugs Bunny's hat.
And we wouldn't know because time's, drifted back to here, and we've unremembered everything over here. We've forgotten it. We've unremembered it because we didn't even forget it.
Yeah, we've unremembered it. We erased it, in other words. Somehow. We went there and then we erased the trail back. Isn't that convenient?
It's actually our brain moved backwards and we unraveled all those memories. And now here we are going forward again. And it's just like a piece of film. You can look at it the other way and see things run it backwards and whatnot. But the things in the film, it just has this forward character.
Yeah, whatever. So all of this because I claim that Galileo never said there was no absolute velocity. He just said that you can't perceive velocity accurately. You can't see it.
Right? We go back and then start going forward. And we'd think once we got back there that we would know that an hour ago we were in the future. We would think that an hour ago we were in the past. And then, boom, re-continuity. And even if things could change, it would go in different paths, we would have this sense of continuity, right? So, there's a...
I don't even know what all this crap came out of. I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with my video, that's for sure.
A lot of tricks that time could play on us. So time could just be a physical process.
Yeah, time could just be a physical process. So again, the argument is that we already figured out what time is. That's what all the forces are doing. It takes time for a force to get from point A to point B in distance. And that time is set. And the only thing that can affect that time is if it goes through a substance where it may not be traveling a straight line. And that's why it takes longer, is because it has to basically ricochet, so to speak. It has to be absorbed and readmitted to get to the other side. And therefore, it can't travel its normal straight line speed because it's not traveling a straight line anymore.
Maybe it is possible that there's certain chemistry where they form their memories in the reverse order of time. We'd see them living their lives backwards, and they would be experiencing...
Yeah, whatever. Again, there's just nothing. There's no way to make any sense out of this idea that you go backward. That there's some sort of undo the space you traveled. There's nothing. There's no evidence you can do that. I can take time to move a force from one place to another, and then I can take time to move it back the opposite direction somehow, and somehow I didn't consume the time going forward and the time going backward. Of course, I consume both of them.
It forwards in their own direction. I don't know. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying we have to be pretty open-minded about time.
Well, whatever. I don't see any evidence of your open mind. Anybody even just question your authority, and you go insane in terms of insulting their intelligence. So fuck you in this bullshit that you have any respect for the lack of evidence you possess to defend these stories about Bugs Bunny's hat.
Because all you have as evidence is a correlation between velocity and a delay in decay. Nothing else.
Yeah, it's a delay in absolutely every physical process.
Okay, now where did he have evidence of that? Where does he have evidence that every single physical process is equally delayed? Where's the evidence of that? I've seen no evidence that changes in velocity, going somewhere and I mean, it's such a tiny amount of what we can measure as it is now. The tiny amount of time lag. You're talking about seconds over maybe millions of miles traveled at very high speeds. And here he is talking as if he knows that every single thing in a proportional manner somehow gets done slower. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm saying there's just absolutely no evidence to verify that one way or the other.
So not just decay, but in every process.
Well, again, if it was in every process, we know that certain other chemical processes take a certain amount of time. So again, where's your evidence that, let's see, I don't know what would be a good clock. I mean, all these clocks are always going to be dependent on gravity, number one. It's hard to go fast in gravity, so you usually have to go out of gravity to go fast. And so most of the processes we're familiar with happen in gravity. And so maybe they automatically function differently when you take them out of gravity, like an hourglass, for example.
Plus, the distortions have also been studied through length contraction and mass distortion.
Well, again, so he claims he has really hard evidence of this stuff. And so, again, he has never posted any links to any of this stuff. He just says, you go out and find it. So I have to go out and find his proof. No, I'm not doing that.
Who's denying it? So again, this false accusation that somehow the evidence has been denied. What evidence do we have? We have...
You said that there was no evidence for the relativity of motion, that it's weakly evidenced. There's actually 400 years of thousands of people in every culture on Earth.
Right, so I could just do that. There's 2,000 years of evidence that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. The evidence is hearsay, and so it's by popularity now. There's no real hard evidence anymore. I mean, the testimony of somebody actually witnessed it, we don't have that anymore, obviously. Can't interrogate the witnesses. So what do we have as evidence? It's weak. And all I'm saying is the only thing we have evidence of is that velocity changes atomic decay. There's probably other things the velocity changes. As I'm pointing out, the matter fundamentally changes. But I would bet that all the changes don't happen in exactly the same proportion. I mean, if you can find different clocks, that's the trick. What other way can you make a clock? I mean, the great thing about an atomic clock is it's an incredibly simple clock. Not the detecting of the radiation, but that's not simple. But the thing making the timing cycle, the thing doing the timing, is a real simple mechanism. It's all the way rudimentary in atoms. So it's hard to find another clock, okay, that is fundamental as that. And I said the only example I can give you is like a light clock, but light clocks won't function in any of the circumstances you want to place them in.
Earth producing this evidence. So that's what I'm saying you're denying.
Muons going through the atmosphere.
So again, I'm 400 years ago, Newton said, I have to believe there's no absolute velocity. I mean, Galileo said that. I don't think he ever said that. And if he did say it, why do I have to accept that? What evidence did he base it on? He didn't know what a photon was, for fuck's sake.
So you get confused. Now you're talking about the time distortion, but this...
no, that was the subject of your video.
This video is really about the history of that.
So it's the history of the thing I'm talking about. Right, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's the subject, yes, that's what I'm talking about.
You're not just denying the part where Einstein says, hey, if Galileo's right...
No, he didn't. Einstein didn't say if Galileo is right. Einstein knew Galileo was right. I mean, Einstein knew, okay, that if two trains pass each other, he knew, yeah, they're not going to be able to tell because there's nothing in between the two moving trains that's stationary. So the only way you can know is there has to be something stationary in your perception. You have to have a reference. Without a stationary reference, you can't tell who's moving. Einstein didn't need Galileo to say it, but he certainly knew that was already established as a fact.
And this other weird shit.
It wasn't like a if he is right. Everybody knew that if you stood on a moving object and threw something, the thing you threw was going to move how fast you're going plus what you threw. And the only time that doesn't work is with force, because force can't carry your momentum.
Has to be true. We checked and it was true.
So again, what did you check that was what was true? Again, I'm saying the only evidence you have is a connection between velocity and changes in material function? What other evidence do you have of any kind of warp in time?
You're not just disagreeing with that. You're disagreeing with Galileo's concept that the velocity is truly relative.
Okay, so you're saying it's truly relative. So I didn't see a Galileo quote where he said the velocity, all velocities are truly relative. That he somehow knew that the baseball doesn't really go 120 miles an hour when it's on a train and then somebody throws it in a direction, and that fundamentally, well, I mean, it is true. The stationary object could be moving, so that's the problem. But I'm just saying, because Galileo pointed the problem out of perception, that you can't perceive without something that is the reference, that he was saying there's absolutely no such thing as velocity. That it's always just some sort of relative thing, and that you can't gain any absolute velocity. And he wasn't saying that, in my opinion.
And you're saying that if you're going half the speed of light and shine a flashlight in front of you, that light's going to move away at half the speed of light.
It can't move away, so that's the problem with what you're saying. If I'm going half the speed of light and I shine light, it can't possibly move away from me, okay, at the speed of light, because I'm running half the speed it's traveling. So it can't possibly escape me, okay, where the first photon that went out of that flashlight can't possibly escape me at the speed of light if I'm moving half the speed of light in the same direction. It's a ludicrous proposition.
Right. And that's not what happens.
When they're hit by cosmic rays and they're accelerated at high speeds and they decay slower. So there's a correlation between velocity.
Right, that's one example that you deny, and there's all...
Again, so he just claimed I just denied something I claimed to be true. I mean, you don't see how that's just lying about my position. I've never denied that muons decay slower. I've never denied the evidence that that happens. I've explained it, not denied it.
The other examples that triangulate on the reality that you also deny.
They triangulate on the reality. Well, that's an interesting statement. I mean, that's like why they fit on Bugs Bunny's head.
And plus, we're talking about going back 400 years and you denying the Galilean reality.
The Galilean reality, again, based on what evidence? What evidence did Galileo have that there's no such thing as absolute velocity? He merely pointed out an observation that things moving at velocity, when they have no internal mechanism to detect acceleration, that they can't tell they're moving. Shit. So unless it's a bumpy road, if it's a smooth velocity, yes, there'd be nothing to indicate I was moving.
That all of Newton's stuff is based on. So you're basically rejecting all of science.
Okay, so now it's all of science, and this isn't even close to being even fundamental, even anything Newton would talk about. I mean, Newton wasn't a very bold or aggressive speculator. He gave you the formulas for gravity without giving you any explanation of why, and he pretty much said, "I've told you what it does, why it does it. Who the hell knows?"
Not just modern science. You're rejecting all science as...
Okay, so again, this bold statement, I'm rejecting all of science because I don't first believe that Galileo claimed there was no absolute frame, and second, that I don't believe it's all of science, that everything all of Newton's equations are based on time dilation, because they're not. The non-existence of an absolute frame. I don't think Newton ever even worried about that.
Woo-woo modern. Even guys 400 years ago, you're saying they wanted there to be no center of the universe. And
I'm saying their description is perfectly accurate, so I'm saying exactly the opposite of what you're claiming I'm saying. I'm saying Galileo's observation was perfectly brilliant. The idea that you would shoot a cannonball, and if you shoot it fast enough, it'll go all the way around the world. Yeah, I mean, it's perfectly rational.
They wanted relativity, and so then they've lied to us for 400 years about it. It's as insane as
Again, my argument is that all you have as evidence is a correlation between velocity and a change in material function. That's it.
and slower radioactive decay. We have experiments with atomic clocks put in airplanes and driven around the Earth, and we have a little bit of decay, change. So there's a correlation strictly between velocity and the rate of decay. What evidence am I denying in saying I can explain that with some other reason than it went into a time well?
because you haven't explained it.
All right. Well, I'm not gonna.
Could be a new.
I'm not gonna argue what is absolute fact. I mean, I just there's no point in me having to defend myself against just completely baseless, again, lies by this guy. I have made the argument. I've pointed out analogies like the dancing argument that matter's doing in any frame. It's doing the best it can. All of its little bits are busy. They're not running at half speed or quarter speed or some other kind of speed. They're doing their thing. And if I now force them to do something else, that is, take all of their perpendicular dimensions and move them in a direction, that they're going to do that thing slower. And so it's a simple analogy that if somebody's dancing and they're dancing as fast as they can, and I ask them to move stage left, they're not going to be able to dance as fast. Just a fact. Because they have to use up time to do the moving thing.
Right, and there's velocity and also what goes on in accelerated frames, which gravitational frames are.
Right, and that's not part of this conversation, right? Because we already know that those accelerated frames are rare frames. Frankly, you have to actually act on something to accelerate. Nothing accelerates for no reason. So those are all frames that have something to do with getting trapped in gravity or some other kind of circumstance, and they're minor time dilation effects from acceleration compared to the time dilation effects from substantial velocity.
And
I mean, if a meteor's coming at us at 300,000 miles an hour or something, the amount of extra speed it's going to get from gravity of Earth is going to be tiny. The real speed is the velocity it has. It's not going to need Earth's gravity to help it along.
And you can explain that if you want with some alternate system. But what you can't do...
Oh, I can, but I'm not allowed to do it and be given the tiniest of courtesies or elements of respect. I will be attacked as somebody who's some nut who's rejecting all of science and insulting both Galileo and Newton's intelligence, when I don't think I've done either one of those.
Say, hey,
I think you're the people who do that. You're the people who's saying their science wasn't real science, that their observations and their caution were foolhardy.
I'll take the current math that works. I'm going to change...
All right, so again, the math. We're back to math. The math is just... there's nothing in Einstein's math. There's no bent space factor. There's no bent gravity factor. They're all factors that have to do with mass and force. He puts force in there. There's a convergence, okay? You know what a divergence is and a convergence is? Well, those are real quantities. So he puts real acceleration in. He doesn't put bent space in. He puts acceleration in.
Change all of the variables in the equations, and just believe me, it's going to work out the same.
It's just a mass and velocity equation. There's nothing else to it. We all know what the force of gravity is. All right? I mean, Newton figured that out. So we don't need Einstein for that. And all Einstein's doing is blaming it, instead of on a force, he's blaming it on a bent space. But again, if you're going to... It's the reverse light bulb. You still have to explain, well, if it's creating a convergence, where does the stuff in the convergence go? How can you have a conveyor belt, okay, that's running all the time? It's perpetual motion. There's no energy in Einstein's equation. No energy in the real world.
If you change the variables in the equations, if you take out mass distortion and put in blue fish, then...
Well, mass distortion, again, is more theoretical than real. But again, mass distortion is nothing more complicated than the fact that you're adding force. So if there's electrons in something, and they have this much arrow, okay, moving through, and then I add to that, okay, I give it acceleration, which will turn into velocity by adding a lot of force. Those are extra arrows here, okay. The extra arrows will be, well, I've got them going in different directions, but it doesn't really matter. So the force is quanta. This is made out of, the electrons are made out of this stuff, but the stuff is made out of stuff. So in a sense, you're gaining the mass of the extra arrows. But at the same time, you're also, to gain real velocity, you're going to have to get rid of mass going the wrong way. So you will be losing some too.
The equations are not going to turn out to...
Well, again, the equations don't have anything to do with any real place in the universe. The equations are only talking about the worlds you're talking about as thought experiments, not as real experiments. So again, you don't have any hard evidence that the equations match anything but your perception of Bugs Bunny's hat. You're telling me you have math that perfectly describes Bugs Bunny's hat. And I'm arguing there's no Bugs Bunny's hat. Okay, that's just an idea you have that exists. You know, there's no evidence that Bugs Bunny's hat exists.
Very unlikely. So that's on you to prove that. But you're calling people fucktards because they...
I don't have to do that. No, I don't. I have to just create a model that duplicates the observable universe through experiment. So I'm just saying, if I can explain the two-slit experiment with an explanation that basically just tells you that no, photons interact with electrons and the electrons are deflecting the light. That's an explanation. It's perfectly legal for somebody to do that. And it's your responsibility to say how it can't be that way.
You go, wait a second, here's what you'd have to, you know...
I mean, if I say I can duplicate exactly Einstein's equations, Mach gravity duplicates Einstein fundamentally perfectly. So all you do is create a force from the outside, okay, that's completely proportional to the whatever you want to call it. I mean, Halliday seems to be protesting that there's no necessity in Einstein's equations to create an attractive force. So I'll just read this. I have explained several times that GR doesn't have any pull forces or use gravity to explain gravity. He gets this for about 2 seconds, but carries on as if he knows something profound about his push being simpler than pull. Nobody's saying pull force. I'm saying that Einstein's equation is fundamentally a pull force. How do you explain the convergence, for fuck's sake? How do you explain Susskind explaining it as a convergence? I mean, he calls it a divergence, but I mean the opposite of a divergence is a convergence. That's Einstein's equation. Einstein's equation is simply it's like having a fluid between two plates of glass, and you have a drain, and you have an infinite source of water to keep refilling the fluid in between the two planes of glass. How can that be interpreted anything other than attraction by pulling through the drain, okay, and creating a convergence? Now that's Susskind. You want to tell me Susskind's full of shit? Fine, but make that argument then. But don't sit there and malign me because I'm saying that's what Susskind says, shithead. Oh, amazing.
Some issues.
So the point is that material gravity, Mach gravity, perfectly duplicates Einstein's equations. So as long as you use his proportions, and you do the calculus over time about how the forces will change because of the two bodies interacting. I mean, there always has to be a two-body equation. There's technically no way to do the equations without the two bodies. You have to have something as the test charge, so to speak, to be able to do the calculation to figure out what the gravity is going to be somewhere. You have to put something there to find out what the gravity would be.
You go, fuck, Dard, you're just a liar. You're just like 400 years of scientists just Making shit up. Yeah, well, I don't have that impression that 400 years of science has been the element of humanity.
All right, well, so that was his thing. Did I do any of that? No, I didn't do any of that. So I don't, again, this is just a bunch of ragging, and it's a slanderous rag. This argument isn't that complicated. I'm saying matter changes when it has velocity. That is, the matter itself, that's why it has inertia. That's why it keeps going. It's because it has an engine of keep going. It's collected a force, and it possesses it inside of it, and the force keeps pushing it.
That just made shit up. Okay, it happens sometimes. People go, what about that cold fusion? You mean the thing that...
All right, so now I'm going to get compared to anybody who was ever wrong. And so, okay, so I'll just say to Pyrrho, well, what about that paramecium crap you posted? And that was completely false science. What about that silly image you posted of the water waves that were created by 3 agitators to create the fake interference pattern in a single slit? So you put up fake evidence. What about that?
And, a few weeks later, the rest of the scientific world was like, nuh-uh. What about the arsenic life forms?
Well, again, I mean, if it's so glaring that I'm guilty of the same crimes as these people, why can't you possibly point out where I've committed a crime of equal dupability, where you can just prove I was wrong? Why don't you just prove there's no electrons between the 2 slits? Why don't you just prove that?
You mean the thing that 3 days later...
That there's no such thing as charge.
The rest of science was like, nuh-uh. That's how science works. There's enough freedom to try and claim and make reports and even get peer-reviewed because you seem to follow all the rules and, of carefulness. And
well, again, we know that that's not what takes place. So, this is just such a... I mean, I can only show it. I show how almost every example of the 2-slit experiment I've ever been able to find, as documented on the internet, is incorrect. And I've pleaded for you to point me to the one that's done correctly. Show me the one that does the math correctly, and show me the one that does the images correctly. Go ahead, show it to me. All right? But until you can do that, I think I've demonstrated that your science is full of shit.
Whatnot. And it doesn't get picked up. It's proved that nobody else can reproduce the cold fusion, so nope. And people are like, they hear a study came out.
Well, again, this really has nothing to do with this conversation. So you're the one who claims Galileo didn't believe in absolute velocity. I haven't seen any quotes where he didn't believe in absolute velocity. So go ahead and show that to me.
And it's like, oh, this is the new truth. No, that's not how it works. It takes 5-10 years before a legitimate new truth is actually confirmed. I mean...
absolute relative to a non-moving frame. So, look, I mean, one of the things that gets a little complicated is suns, okay? So you could say that a sun is sort of a good timepiece. Produces white light. That's what we see. And white light is kind of this even distribution of the red and the blue 2 extremes. And so without that even distribution, it's not going to be white anymore. And so then you have this idea of redshift. But I guess the real problem is the only time redshift really reveals itself is when you get up to pretty fast speeds. And so it gets hard to tell who's going 50,000 miles an hour, for example. A little bit hard to tell with just redshift. But I'm just saying you can sort of tell, though, that most of the universe isn't moving at spectacular speeds because it's not redshifted. The suns are producing white light. We're seeing white light, which indicates we certainly can't be moving at some obnoxious speed of light, some percentage of it. Because then light we couldn't possibly see it without it being blue shifted.
When my grandmother was dying of Alzheimer's, I watched Alzheimer's news really close, and believe me, they've cured Alzheimer's 20 times.
Let me move the head. Is where the hell
they've cured it 100 times in rats, but...
So again, this has something to do with the fact that the single slit and double slit experiment can't ever be described by scientists accurately. This has something to do with that subject and the fundamental subject, which is everything you claim to exist, you claim to exist based on very, 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 very weak evidence. Not volumes of evidence, not evolution kind of evidence, weak evidence.
Humans. But if you just believed the first start, you'd think it was already cured 20 years ago. But it's not, because you have to wait and see, because science is about checking up on these ideas. And they don't.
Well, again, you say it's about checking up on these ideas. No, it's about theorizing about conditions that we can't possibly access, worlds we can't go to, the speed of light world. We can't travel, we can't push matter anywhere near the speed of light. You're never going to see any of these effects.
Even get to make those claims, really, until they have an experiment, and then even the experiments, they have to be redone more than once. There's a lot of things that can go wrong.
And so many of these experiments haven't been done more than once. I don't even know if the Alan Aspect experiment using his secret mirror has ever been redone.
You're not trying to do any of that shit.
It fell into a time warp.
Well, whatever. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. What kind of shit am I supposed to be doing? Okay, it's theoretical physics, which is always going to be kind of requires you to get into fields where you're not going to have access to volumes of evidence. You have to go based on what fits the volume of the evidence, the most of the evidence, so to speak. And clearly I'm going to argue that in most circumstances light travels in a straight line, and it doesn't do anything else until it hits something. Something that's not a force.
Time actually slowed down, but it wasn't ticking in the rest of the universe at exactly the same rate.
Well, I'm really glad that after 10 years we could catch up to what the argument should have fucking started out as. Yeah, that is Einstein's position for which he was held to be a genius, because it all panned out.
Again, there's nothing that panned out here, right? Again, I'll just make the simple argument. The idea that there's a connection between gravity and acceleration and velocity is all that Einstein is playing with. And the idea of the equivalence principle, which is any velocity is velocity and any acceleration is an acceleration. You can't tell moving up and down in an elevator or changing a gravitational field or whatever. It doesn't matter. Acceleration is acceleration and velocity is velocity. And it's just, he's just changing what creates velocity, in a sense, bent space, and the fact that now that he has bent the space, he's going to now connect any changes to matter to the fact that there exists a bend in space, rather than there being a mechanical reason why when things are moving, their physics is different. The physics inside the matter moving is different. I mean, it's like, there's so many ways, is it time dilation that when we put things in a centrifuge, the heavier bits fly to the end? I don't think so.
In laboratories.
Do I need bent space to make that happen?
So sorry that happened to you emotionally.
That it somehow is cheating time. So again, another accusation. Just keep saying it, and
no, it's not an accusation. We say, and I know there is 400 years of evidence for the relativity of velocity.
Okay, so we have evidence. So it wasn't just that Galileo said something about an observation. There's somehow evidence, and the evidence is what? That when two people are passing each other on moving objects, if there's no indication like wakes in front of the boat or something, if they're just passing by, they can't tell who's moving what speed. They just know that combined they're going 80 miles an hour, but they don't know who's going which way, at what speed.
Velocity, and there's 100 years of evidence for the relativity of space-time.
Well, whatever. Evidence. So again, what evidence is 100 years old for space-time? What evidence do you have that's 100 years old?
Whatever it turns out to be, the relativity being the distortions that are predicted in time and mass and length.
Well, I could again point out how the evidence of even Einstein's, the thing that he got the thing that he was, that he got noticed for, was the idea of photons being able to be bent by gravity. And again, the factual evidence is that we can't make photons. They don't go slower when we shoot them away from the Earth, and they don't go faster when they fall into a gravity well, but somehow sideways they're affected. That doesn't sound quite right. Yeah, and there's absolutely no evidence that they can be moved by the other forces like magnetism. You can push as much magnetism you want as a photon. You can't bend its direction. Why wouldn't a photon be affected by magnetism if it's going to be affected by gravity? Come on.
That we've checked. There's 100 years of that and 400 years of the other, and you're saying it's weakly evidence, and you say
I'm just saying okay. So and your claim to it being weakly evidence is not, but that's all I hear is a claim. I'm not seeing any evidence. I'm not seeing you pointing me to this hard evidence. So again, your inability to sit there and post a link for which you want to claim is reliable and dependable, and I won't be able to find a flaw in it. You have this absolute proof. Well, show it to me. I mean, Hothloday gave me some images for lensing, right? Well, there are, studies with radio waves, all kinds of different things, microwave put through by bodies. But the problem is they can't tell because they have to go so close to the body that they've probably got a bunch of scatter from the atmospheres. Again, the sun produces a huge atmosphere full of little bits that are going to deflect light. And so they can't tell what's bent light and what's scattered light.
they never did two slits. They've never shot light through one slit.
Now, see again, so this is, these people who say, okay, it's okay for him to say that. So not only is it disgusting that all of these professionals can't accurately describe the two-slit experiment, he can't even accurately describe my statements about those experiments. I mean, in the context of me pointing out, look here, look, watch them deceive people, watch them do it. And then he sits there with his glib face and lies about my argument. I've never claimed they never did the single slit experiment. I mean, that never happened. So he just lied.
Right? And that's what you're in denial about. It's not an accusation. It is a statement on the fact that you admit that you don't accept that that's happened.
That what's happened? Again, it's just preposterous. You're claiming I have to accept an experiment you have no evidence ever took place, okay, which wasn't the single slit, but which obviously was the single slit with unread detectors. That never happened.
You don't think they've done those experiments for 400 years. Nobody's checked.
Well, they certainly haven't done them for 400 years. I mean, it's just kind of a silly point to make. There's no 400 years of complex lighting experiments.
The last 100 years. They just liked the idea so much, they assumed it, and then they started building computer manufacturing plants based on engineering.
No, I mean, Newton discovered Newton's rings, and he wasn't silly enough, okay, to make up stories about what caused it. He just said, look at this, it's fucked up. I don't know why it does that. He didn't say he knows, oh, it's wave interference. Yeah, the light goes in, it gets all confused, and it decides to multiply, and then fuck with itself.
Derived from it, but it's not true. That doesn't seem credible to many of us. Okay, so I'm calling it denial. It's not an act.
Okay, yeah, I'm calling it denial. I'm going to, I mean, what do you want to say? You want to say, oh, I'm calling it child molestation because, yes, you educated your child to be a Muslim, and I think that's molesting a child. Yes, theoretically, that's what I think. Okay, so you think any time somebody disagrees with you, they're denying reality, and that's fundamentally what you're saying. Okay, so now I understand your vernacular now. Okay, I'm a truth denier when I disagree with you. It has nothing to do with evidence. It just has to do with me disagreeing with your interpretation of evidence.
accusation, you reject all of those experiments happened.
Well, there we go. So he said it again. So go ahead, detail the experiment I claim didn't happen. Go ahead, let's see the experiment I claim didn't happen. Point me to the experiment I claim didn't happen, okay? And then I'll say, wow, look, it did happen. But none of your cowards, none of you liars, the group of liars, Hathaway, the whole group of liars here, none of you liars have the guts to do that. I mean, what's that? Is that challenging? You claim I've denied the existence of an experiment. Well, why don't you show me the experiment? Show me a link to the fucking experiment I'm denying. Go ahead. Show it to me.
And since I know they did happen, from my point of view, relative to my perspective, that amounts to denial. Because the fact that the...
Right, okay, you know they happened. You don't really feel any obligation to prove they happened, so you're just going to tell me I must accept your authority. Oh, okay.
Those experiments have happened is available to you. They have not all been translated into books on tape or made...
All right, so the fundamental experiment of physics, the nail in the coffin, wave-proof physics experiments, they don't bother detailing them in the books or putting them online or doing any of that. They got this hard evidence, but the hard, great evidence, the greatest experiments on the subjects, the ones that really prove the subject, nope. There's 10 million experiments online, but they won't put those online because... yeah, right. Because that would make sense. And, of course...
to videos on YouTube. But you can read 400 years of scientific literature if you want.
Well, I don't want to. So, yeah, no, I'm not the one who thinks I need to. I don't think I need to reread the way people wrongly speculate about reality. I mean, I read a little bit about Huygens and his frickin' ether theories, and I read a little bit about even Maxwell, and he was really trying to make ether make sense. And all my brain kept saying is, well, you got the straight line part right. Why do you need this ether crap? You're right there. Another guy who had it right in his hand. I mean, all he had to do was just... and he did exactly the opposite. Again, instead of recognizing light as a force, he just left it as made it a manifestation of an ether.
And you can just pick out the experiments that were done, but you cherry pick things that you would like to, like maybe they did lie or fudge the evidence on the original. I don't think so, but on the original, it was a very difficult experiment, and they were off in the cold. Who knows how it really went? Maybe they'll...
Yeah, they didn't fudge it. So even fudge you won't even go for. When we know the fudge happened, okay? Whether the fudge was critical to the experiment, we know it happened, okay? So that's not even debatable. The fact that they had to fudge with it, they had to spend a year going, well, what kind of plates do you have? Well, our plates are a little different, so maybe you could just throw out that one, okay? We know that fudge happened.
About the relativity with that eclipse. On the other hand, they've checked 100 other ways.
Okay, that's all I'm saying. So 100 other ways, right, that aren't the same experiment. So they can't redo the experiment ever, essentially properly. So every time they try to do it, every time there's an eclipse, they fuck it up. So yes, it's never going to happen when there's an eclipse. But I've argued that they can do it with the Hubble telescope any day of the week. Any day of the week, they can watch the whole star field go flying right behind that sun and getting warped all over the fucking place. Every day they can do that. And show me a picture of how that sun that's behind the sun is now visible. They can do that every day.
They build something like GPS, and if they don't take those accounts, those effects in...
again, they're using the same evidence over and over and over again. Just keep claiming that because there's a relationship between velocity and time dilation, I must accept your interpretation of why that happens. I can't believe, it's not reasonable to believe that matter changes when you give it velocity. That's unreasonable. Matter does not change when you give it velocity. That's an unreasonable speculation. No. So the clock's matter doesn't change. I must believe that the space changes.
To account of the time dilation properties of a gravity well and the relative velocities, that the thing won't work. To tune it, you have to take that into account. That is evidence that they've gotten the math right. Now, what would the
Well, again, there's no. You keep saying this is evidence of something. The fact that they set it up to have a conclusion based on something already observed to be a fact. That yes, when you accelerate matter, the clock breaks, and then they break some clocks, and then they say, "Look, we've proved it. The clocks are broken." Sorry, no sale. Show me the evidence I'm denying.
interpretation? Your interpretation is that a perfectly functional satellite's actually broken.
It's broken as a clock. It's not measuring time the same way as a piece of light going right next to it would be measuring time. The light's doing time accurately. The thing, the satellite, isn't doing time accurately. Its watch is broken. It's not doing the same time calculations as the speed of light is. The speed of light is always doing time correctly, and the only thing that can ever be broken are the material clocks.
You use the word broken. We use the word distortion because it seems to be in functional order. It's just that it's operating slower. So we don't call that broken, but it's the...
Well, if it's operating slower, then you have to concede that nothing really, the time hasn't dilated, right? If the clock is moving slower, then you're conceding that the matter is moving slower. It's functioning less efficiently. It's not because it's in a time warp. It's not doing time. It's merely not doing all the steps. It's dancing slower because it's doing something else. It's moving, and that's absorbing its time. So for some portion of the day, it's not like it's still living a normal life. It's just basically taking pieces of its life out where it's not doing the living thing. So it's like an analogy would be that if I get velocity, what happens to me structurally is that I live my life, but every second there's a tiny millisecond where I stop and nothing happens, and then I go, and then I stop, and all those little stops add up to the dilation. What does that have to do with any kind of frame of reference? What does that have to do with anything? It merely has to do with the fact that the matter is functioning differently because it's doing more stuff than it was before, which is moving at a velocity.
Same thing that you and us are talking about. You say, when the universe is not behaving the way I like, it's broken, that's all. It doesn't happen because it's broken then. When it happens...
I'm just saying, whatever it's perceiving, it's not perceiving correctly. Can't you see the implications? If we're conceding that if I'm moving slower and I'm perceiving everything inaccurately, now isn't that the definition of what I'm saying? I'm saying you're not perceiving it correctly. And again, the argument would be that if you did do these real experiments at the speed of light, there would be no inaccurate perception because you just wouldn't have any perception to begin with. Again, if you try to put the light clock in the moving spaceship, even in the moving spaceship, you're never going to see the photon hit the mirror, bounce off the mirror, and come back to the receiver. Because the mechanical experiment can't